Hello, everyone. This is Melissa Lentz. I'm the Director of Education at OCEG, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast today, during which we will discuss the ESG shift from Buzzword to operational GRC. The trending topic of ESG has rapidly gained momentum and has changed from a buzzword to a necessity. It has become a requirement for board and senior leadership to incorporate ESG topics into their GRC agenda. With critical requirements and deadlines set for ESG assessment and reporting, the pressure is on for organizations to build a strategic plan and execute it. We are glad you can join our expert speakers as they provide their ESG trend predictions for 2022, discuss practical insights, and provide actionable guidance for your ESG framework. For our discussion today, we are joined by the following speakers: Carl Viertel, GM GRC with Mitratech, and Michael Rasmussen, GRC analyst with GRC 2020. We are very pleased to be joined by these speakers as they discuss the ESG shift from buzzword to operational GRC. But before we start, I'd like to take a minute to go over a few housekeeping notes. First, regarding continuing education credit. We provide NASBA-approved CPE credit to you for participation in live webinars if you have an OCEG All Access Pass, which you can purchase individually or as part of a company subscription. The All Access Pass includes many benefits in addition to CPE credit for webcasts, such as access to all OCEG resources and on-demand education series. So if you don't already have a pass, I would encourage you to check it out on the OCEG site. If you do have an All Access Pass and would like a certificate of completion for CPE for this event, please be sure to stay with us for the entire hour and to answer all the polls. These are requirements for receiving CPE credit for this event. And please note, certificates of completion for CPE credit are available only for live events. They are not available for viewing archived webinars. Second, regarding the recording from this webcast. In a couple of days, we will have the recording of this event posted on the OCEG website. Just log into the site, then go to the Webinars tab and select Past Webinar Recordings, and then this webcast. This recording may be viewed by anyone for about 1 week, and after this time, the recording may be viewed by anyone with an All Access Pass. Third, regarding upcoming events and activities. Please watch your email for announcements from OCEG about other upcoming webinars. You can view information about these upcoming webcasts on the OCEG site. So today we will address the following learning objectives. We will identify noticeable shifts in ESG from 2021 and the outlook for 2022, learn how to move from buzzword to operational ESG, identify ESG's role in GRC, define ESG in practical terms, and learn about ESG and culture. But before we hand over the presentation to our speakers, we'd like to offer our first poll. And again, please be sure to answer this poll question if you are interested in receiving CPE credit for this event. The first poll question is, do you have an OCEG All Access Pass, which is a paid membership, and would you like to receive CPE credit for this event? So as you're answering this poll question, I'd like to hand over the presentation to our speakers to begin our discussion today.
Hey, thanks so much. Hey, Michael, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
So I was wondering if Michael Rasmussen in the space of GRC needs an introduction, but for just on the off chance that there's someone out there that hasn't heard of you, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. Well, first off, I'm an OCEG fellow, so we're on an OCEG webinar, so I should start with that. I do a lot of interaction with OCEG and proud to to be able to be part of OCEG. In my day job, I'm an analyst. I have 28 years total experience, and 22 of those as an analyst. I spent 7 years at Forrester Research as vice president and top analyst, and I guess the creator of the GRC market and space back in February 2002. And I've been independent for the last 15 years. So that's 22 years experience total as an analyst. And my job is research as an analyst. I spend my days and nights figuring out what are the challenges companies faced in the context of governance, risk, and compliance. And right now, one of those big challenges is ESG, our topic today, and how they go about addressing those challenges with strategy, process, and particularly technology, and what technology out there differentiates itself. So that's the overall focus of what I deliver, and looking forward to this interaction with you.
Well, luckily, this isn't our first interaction, and throughout my career in GRC, we've crossed paths many a time. I started out my real work in GRC when I was working at Deloitte in the risk management services there. I went on to found my own GRC technology company called Align, and now I'm incredibly happy to be part of the Mitratech team. I run the GRC business for Mitratech as general manager, and really look forward to tackling our ESG topic today. And when we sort of got about or started talking about how to frame the topic today, I really liked the two elements that are in that title, which is buzzword and actual and implementation. And it really, for me, kind of calls out where we are in, where we were in 2021 and where we're heading in 2022. I mean, Michael, I've, follow you on LinkedIn and various other sources, and of course, also the GRC 2020 blog. And you were on so many ESG events in 2021. Did we get past the buzzword stage?
Oh, I think buzzword, that's a hard thing to say, because I see a lot of buzz around it out there, because everybody, gets attracted to whatever the latest marketing buzzwords are, whether it's GRC, IRM from Gartner, ESG and things. And so do I see a lot of buzz? Yes. But is ESG a reality? No doubt about it. It's hitting us from every direction. Investors like BlackRock and State Street are making investment decisions in businesses based on their ESG practices. The board of directors has a lot of attention on this, because individual directors are being voted out by ESG metrics. If you don't hit these ESG metrics, you're not on the board. You're seeing the regulators focus on this, whether it's the SEC regulation right now, the Federal Reserve, going over to Europe. I mean, you've got the EU directive in this area on corporations due diligence. You have Germany's Corporations Due Diligence Act. And then you've got the whole slew of regulations that pour into aspects of ESG, like anti-bribery and corruption. You have the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, step into in France. Modern slavery, you got conflict minerals, California's Transparency in Supply Chains Act, UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australia Slavery Act. I mean, there's so many regulations that pour into aspects of this, but the whole focus is bundling it all together. And how do we do ESG reporting? ESG is going to be much bigger than Sarbanes-Oxley ever was on a global basis.
I agree. I'd say that my observation in 2021, though, is that there's a lot of awareness. There's a lot of talk about it, but I'm not quite sure that there's, to take your Sarbanes-Oxley analogy, all of the internal control systems are in place, so to speak.
Yep.
And I personally see that as the big mission for 2022 is actually taking that into reality and making it a corporate reality over the coming months.
Yep, definitely.
Maybe to frame it a little bit more, because I really like the graphic on this slide here, where we look at those E, S, and G separately, because there's a sort of knee-jerk reaction when you hear ESG to think of climate, CO2 emissions, and sort of really drill down on that. But I would argue it is so much broader, and to be honest, the S and the Gs are potentially even the more complex areas to tackle.
They are. And when you look at this, it's really important. And to me, when we see that what's going on at ESG out there right now, to me, it reminds me of the whole parable of the three blind men and the elephant. What one person, feels the trunk and thinks it's a tree. Another person feels the side of the elephant and thinks it's a wall. And somebody plays around with the tail and think it's a rope. And that's what we see with ESG sometimes, is that the people look at different aspects of it. They think it's all about the E, the environment, or the S with the social, or the G at the governance. And it's really all the above, and reporting across these different areas. Another thing is we've had aspects of ESG before. Well, of course, we've had the details of ESG, like bribery and corruption, privacy, environmental, health and safety, child labor, forced labor. I mean, we can unpack a lot in these areas. But we've had a broader perspectives before, like corporate social responsibility. But the issue there is corporate social responsibility, what we called CSR, was passed around the organization like a hot potato, and often landed in the lap of marketing, became a branding exercise. So they came up with a brilliant idea: let's put green in our logo, and that was their CSR response. That doesn't work for ESG. ESG's got a lot of teeth from investors and stakeholders and regulators and customers and clients and employees, and so much coming at us from all directions. It's got to be a reality with accountability. And getting to the heart of your question, Carl, I mean, the E is one of the hardest things to tackle right now, because we're all in the same boat. Nobody's completely figured out the E and how to deliver on it, because the environmental dystopia that we're headed towards. I did that blog on Is Our Future Blade Runner, Star Trek?
Yep.
We're trying to figure out how to avoid Blade Runner and aim for a Star Trek future. But we're all in the same boat, and so there's some forgiveness in the E because we're all trying to figure that out. The G is the most common element. So the other thing with the E is that it varies a lot between industries. The environmental program at a bank looks a lot different from an environmental program at a petroleum or a mining company. But there's a lot of consistency in the G, because there you get into things like anti-bribery and corruption, fraud, anti-money laundering, internal controls over financial reporting, information security, tax transparency. And there's a lot of consistency between the industries and the G. And so sometimes the G is the easiest to grapple, but the most unforgiving I find is the S. There's some forgiveness in the E, there's a little forgiveness in the G, but the S, if you have social issues on inclusivity, diversity, harassment, discrimination, child labor, forced labor, those issues haunt you for years or even decades and just tarnish your reputation and brand. To me, some of the most risky from a reputation and brand perspective is the S that we've seen.
I'd agree. And I think what makes it especially risky is the risk velocity on the social element in sort of today's environment, right? I mean, the speed at which your reputational damage or your reputational risk can skyrocket by getting that wrong is mind-boggling. I mean, there are enough examples just in the last few months to know what the real risk at hand is when looking at that ESG program. So we're going to get into, of course, how this all relates in sort of the operational risk or wider enterprise risk topics. But there was one further question that we had on this element, and I guess we kind of answered it, but is there a dominant aspect, or is it fair to say that E, S, and G cannot really be viewed in isolation anymore?
No, people need to have a program that goes across it, because the reporting and the regulations, what we're seeing come out there, address E, S, and G. I mean, you look at Germany's Corporations Due Diligence Act, and the German law better than I do. I mean, you can read the German, read it in German. Well, I don't understand German, but it requires continuous due diligence and third-party relationships across the E, the S, and the G. And so we're seeing the regulators focus on all aspects of this together for integrated reporting, but there's still a lot of regulations that focus on one aspect of it too. But no matter what, organizations need to have some type of ESG reporting, and that requires some accountability and structure in the organization.
Agreed. Now on the next slide, in preparing, we had a bit of a chuckle here because the title was actually the other way around when we started out. So we had GRC's role in ESG, and we looked at that and both said, well, actually, it's more ESG's role in GRC. But I guess you could argue it both ways. So to a degree, you could say, well, it is certainly something that's impacting risk. It's certainly an area of governance for the organization. And it is certainly in the responsibility of compliance to understand and have an appropriate ESG risk management. So just by definition, it certainly is fair and square in the GRC space. But I'd say that the place it lives in the organization as compared to maybe an enterprise risk management might be slightly different. What do you think? Did we get the title right in this slide, or is there an argument to put it the other way around?
I think that the title's right. I mean, it's like Sarbanes-Oxley. When I first defined GRC back in February 2002, I had a broad vision for it, but Sarbanes-Oxley came out that year too because of Enron and WorldCom.
Yeah.
And GRC for the first several years was really about Sarbanes-Oxley reporting. Sorry, I had to take a little swallow there. But then on top of that, I've talked a lot about ESGRC because we have the common binding element of the G, the governance. But the reality is that ESG is just like Sarbanes-Oxley. It's what GRC can deliver for ESG reporting and monitoring the enterprise. You look at the GRI and the SASB and all these different standards and frameworks out there, they're overall reporting frameworks. They don't necessarily tell you how to operationalize ESG.
Yeah.
To me, that's where GRC comes in, defines the process to identify ESG related risks, to be able to monitor those risks and to address those risks in the organization.
Yeah, I actually recently wrote a chapter in the RegTech Black Book that RegTech organization here in Europe puts out. And basically the argument was you can't really do operational risk without ESG, and you can't do ESG without operational risk, and operational risk being arguably a big subset of the GRC model. And so the argument being, if you're looking at a modern organization, you cannot get a complete view of operational risk without looking at how ESG elements are going to affect that risk. And at the same time, how are you going to get your insights to your ESG risk exposure if you do not apply the processes and also the technology and the approach to and methodology to gathering what your ESG risks are, right? And that is exactly where GRC and more specifically operational risk provide us with those practices and structures to get to our insights. But maybe the big question is, who owns it? Who's responsible for it? Because, and I'm just going to argue devil's advocate first on a few of the roles, and happy to hear your position on it. So let's say it's not the chief risk officer, because it goes beyond the remit of what you would traditionally purely view as the risk to the organization and the risk exposure. It's not necessarily only a legal topic, because it is much broader and it has to be, more operational. It's too governance in nature to be a CEO topic or a CFO topic. And is it the compliance officer? Maybe. Do we need a new role in the second line specifically for ESG? Fast forward a few years, where is ESG going to sit? And maybe one final thought, when we started with information security management as a real governance and a corporate function, it was probably some subset in the CIO's department, and now the CISO is a fully established role. Are we going to see an ESG CISO?
And that's really where I see this, is that ESG is being most often handed to the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, the CECO or CCO, the Chief Compliance Officer. At the end of the day, ESG is about the integrity of the organization, that its values and commitments to the environment, to the social aspect, and to the governance of the organization, that it's a reality. I've been arguing for the last 15 years, gosh, maybe 17 years now, that the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer really should be called the Chief Integrity Officer. That what the organization's values, code of conduct, ethics, commitment to regulations and other obligations, that's a reality in the organization. This role, the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, is about the integrity of the organization. And that's ultimately what ESG is about, is what we commit on paper in our reporting, that our values and commitments to ESG is, that it's lived out in the organization and throughout its relationships. It's about integrity. And so I see in my interactions and research that it's often ethics and compliance, the corporate compliance and ethics department, that leads this. Not all the time. There's times I've seen operational risk lead with it. There's times I've seen audit lead with it, particularly in smaller organizations. But the most common role I see is the corporate compliance and ethics department, and to lead it. But no matter what, there's not one department that's involved. It's not a single department initiative, because this transcends a lot of departments, whether procurement and finance and accounting and IT security and legal and privacy. And the environmental group and health and safety group and marketing, and so much is involved in aspects of this.
Yeah. And I mean, again, once again, to argue the devil's advocate point here would be for the compliance officer. Just from this week in Europe, we've had some really severe storms, right? And some might argue that resulting damages from increased or more severe storms is a result of weather patterns changing, and therefore a ESG risk for assets of the corporation that are exposed to these more severe storms, right? And intuitively, that's not a compliance topic. So the chief compliance officer kind of is, out of his or her depth in those kinds of topics. And so I fully agree that this multidimensional area of accountability is a real challenge to find the right home for ESG in the corporation.
Yep.
Maybe to also talk a little bit more about then the implementation. So more of the, not just the governance, but also the process side. And we've touched on this a number of times already, but in my view, there's a lot of commonality in approach to enterprise risk as it is to ESG risk. I would argue that the methodology for gathering risk needs to be applied to ESG. I would argue the methodology for evaluating, so qualitative and quantitative evaluation of ESG risks needs to follow the ERM standard. I would also argue that ESG risks to a degree are also, however, very different because your treatment options are severely limited in a number of cases. If you take a standard ERM risk, a treatment option of mitigation is, certainly always on the table. I'd say for an ESG risk, mitigating them is not always possible. It's more of a living with them and trying to be resilient.
Most definitely, not only resilient, but also agile. And that's the three themes in my GRC research this year is the agility, resilience, and integrity. The integrity is the ESG, but it also depends on, just as you're stating here already, it's very dependent upon resilience, but also agility. Resilience is this ability to recover from an event. If I'm running down the street and I trip over in a pothole or on a curb and fall on my face, resilience is how quickly can I get back up and run again? How quickly can I recover from an event? We also need to have agility. How can we be agile so that if I'm running down the street, I can see that pothole or that curb or that obstacle and run around it? Or, if I'm doing parkour, actually leverage and use it to some great acrobatic feat. But we need to not only be resilient, we need to be agile, and we need to be agile from an ESG context. So if we see something coming at us, how can we prepare for the organization and minimize the impact on the organization, or avoid the impact, or even leverage the whatever's hurtling at us as an opportunity for the organization?
Agreed. So I think we want to hear from you all now. And what we want to hear about is your GRC strategy. So what sounds more or most like your current ESG strategy? So is the strategy connected to the GRC strategy? Does the GRC strategy lead? Is ESG separate, or are you just fundamentally unsure? Looking forward to the results on that one. And while you answer, maybe we can talk a little bit about overall strategic approach here. The big question with any compliance requirement is, of course, do we do a tick the box exercise, or do we actually see real benefit in addressing ESG risk? Or are we just forced to for legal requirements? And obviously your strategy is highly dependent on how you view your obligation here. Where do you think the organizations that you speak to, and sort of which of those bucket do they fall?
Oh, wow. To be honest, it's all over these. I see a lot of people that are trying to leverage their GRC strategy to deliver on ESG. So option number one.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, option number two. The GRC strategy leads the ESG strategy. I don't see as much of option A, where their GRC strategy is connected to the ESG strategy. If it's connected, yeah, I mean, there are some there, but I'm seeing a lot of organizations focus on B, but it is all the above. But the thing that I routinely get when we talk about technology is that that really influences the B is that I'm hearing organization after organization say, we don't want another platform. We don't want another platform. You know,
Yeah.
we want to be able to leverage either what we already have or find something that can do multiple things, because at the end of the day, ESG is about workflow, tasks, gathering information for reporting. This is what GRC software like, Mitratech Online does, but
Yep.
to be able to gather information and use workflow and tasks and automation and integration and things to capture that information for reporting. And I'm hearing a lot of organizations that say we don't want just a completely separate redundant solution out there.
Well, I really like that. That is a great segue into talking about ESG in practical terms. So I guess the big question would be where to start, right? So a lot of organizations, let's say they've defined their strategy and it's very clear we're not going to get out of this. This is something we need to do. We need to understand what technology are we going to leverage? What frameworks are we going to leverage? And how do we approach it? I'm assuming you've gotten quite a few inquiries over the past few months on exactly that. How do you advise your customers on that? Where to start?
First off, there's a lot of inquiries on this. It seems like I have an ESG conversation just about every day. The last couple of weeks, the only thing that's really popping up more is this whole risk and resiliency and bringing risk management and resiliency together, because that's a very hot topic right now.
Yeah.
But ESG is right up there with it. And the reality is that I tell organizations, you're doing something today already. I don't think there's an organization out there that doesn't have any approach to environmental and social and governance issues. If you dig down in the weeds of the organization, you're going to find that there's elements of ESG out there already, because we're doing something for information security. We're doing something for privacy. We're doing something for fraud or internal controls or financial reporting or procurement and dealing with the supply chain and social labor risks and things. I mean, there might be gaps. There's no doubt about that. But if you unpack the E, the S, and the G and find all the components of the E, the S, and the G that make up those individual areas, you're going to find that you're doing pieces of this already. And to me, that's where I tell organizations to start, is understanding what is your current state, what's working out there, what's not working, and then define your future state. This is what ESG should look like in the next year or maybe 2 years. And this is our roadmap to move from our current state to our future state. That's where I'm seeing a lot of organizations are right now, is they're just trying to find out what is ESG, where does it report, who's accountable for it, but then really understanding the current state. What do we do? What do we have in place today? And what's working, what's not working, and what needs to change?
Hmm. I know that we initially spoke about in our prep, and I really like your point on here, is that there's a big difference between responsibility and accountability when implementing ESG. Have we, or how do you get to the, or let's ask the question slightly differently. What does it mean when accountability for ESG risk management has really been assigned, right? What does target state look like in that case?
What does accountability for ESG look like? Was that the question?
Yeah.
For me, it's about who is ultimately accountable for the entire ESG program. And to me, again, there's different roles that can fall to, but I'm seeing the chief ethics compliance officer or the corporate and compliance and ethics department fulfilling that role most often, not always, but most often. And so who's accountable for the whole program, but then also who's accountable for different aspects of this? And so who's accountable for the environmental pieces and the social pieces? But that's just, again, not one accountability, because you unpack social and you've got privacy and data protection, and that's probably gonna be accountable to the chief privacy officer. dealing with forced labor and child labor and supply chains, probably going to go over to procurement or some other group dealing with third-party relationships for accountability, maybe even legal there. And so it's defining out those sub-accountabilities as well in those individual components. And that becomes important. So accountability is really important, but there's a difference between accountability and responsibility. Responsibility, I can outsource. I can take tasks or responsibilities and give them to somebody else to do. Accountability, I cannot. I might give the tasks out, but if there's an issue, I own it. And a lot of these aspects, like if you're dealing with financial services, and you're over in the United Kingdom or Ireland or Australia or Hong Kong or Singapore, you have all these accountability regimes. And you take UK SMCR, you have 28 senior management functions that you have to assign accountability for different aspects of risk and control. A lot of these map into ESG, including, banks operating out of the United Kingdom right now, or financial services company operating out of the United Kingdom have to have a senior management function responsible for the environmental risk impact on the bank's assets. And they're accountable. And so we're seeing a lot of focus on accountability.
From an implementation perspective, obviously the first step would be to understand what your ESG risk exposure is. And this leads us to, in my view, one of the key challenges around ESG risk management, which is if we take an analysis, maybe in Sarbanes-Oxley or in ISMS, right? So information security management, we have reasonably well-defined frameworks that actually get very specific, right? So if I take, for example, ISO 27001 in the ISMS space, so for information security, it actually gets in, the Appendix A, it gets very specific about what is required of an organization in order to have appropriately managed information security. Right. Sarbanes-Oxley, of course, is slightly less specific and, focuses a lot around materiality, but we've had, it's been around for so long that there's, reasonably established control frameworks where, all your professional services firms know exactly what they're looking at around change management and your various domains in your internal control system. And I find that for ESG, that's not as well defined, right? So the UN probably was one of the first with their sustainability goals to, at least put some structure around the ESG topic. And of course, the SASB has been doing some really great work in, creating some very industry specific categorizations of, what are the elements that you should be looking at. I'd say the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance is, an incredibly long document, but it boils down to very few categories. But if you're looking at how do I measure it, right? How do I know that I'm complete? How do I look at a organization that I'm looking to invest in and understand, well, what is the actual ESG risk resulting from my investment in this specific equity? It's a bit challenging, I'd say. Have you come across a framework that gets more specific and actually is, the ISO 27001 of ESG?
Not yet. I mean, there's a lot of aspects and frameworks you can put together, and that's what organizations need to do, is they need to build their own framework out of all the other frameworks out there. I'm not aware of anything from the ESG standpoint that really fits the needs of all industries and all aspects of ESG. And so it's really coming up with your own piece and also having the right technology in place, like what you deliver, that can report into different frameworks, because maybe I've got my ESG program and framework that I've sort of customized from a variety of other frameworks. But, for one set of stakeholders, I might have to report in the GRI framework, and another set of stakeholders, I might have to report in some other, reporting standard. And so having a technology that can be versatile in how it reports, because different groups might want different types of reporting. But the ESG framework is rather customized to the individual organization. And that's also where I see where the GRC capability model comes in to help deal with the actual impact of managing ESG related processes.
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly the impression and also the thinking that we had when we approached this topic. And we said, well, in lack of a real industry standard, or sort of, the, for lack of a better analogy, the ISO 27001 of ESG. We went about thinking about that, and we leveraged the World Economic Forum's approach, in that they identified what they call mega trends, right? And so what we've also been doing is, thinking about what are the mega trends that we think are going to be most affecting organizations in the next 5, 10, 50 years. And those mega trends, of course, are aligned in all of the E, S, and G elements. And then we sort of break them down into sub-trends and individual data points with questions and data points that you can collect in this space, and of course, resulting risks. And I think another challenge that, of course, you run into is that we're dealing with, or as everything in risk management, trying to predict the future, but we're also trying to predict the future that is, I'd say, in a number of areas of ESG, politically laden, to be stated lightly. And so I think there's also a political element there, where you actually have to we formed hypotheses around these mega trends, right? So we didn't say X is going to happen because of Y, but we're saying, what if this happened? How would that affect your business, or how would that affect this aspect of how you generate value for an organization, right? So it's, in my view, it's an incredibly complex task to tailor that framework for your organization, make it applicable across potentially industries where you're investing. Let's say if you're doing this from a perspective of a asset manager or a financial services institution, and at the same time also make it palatable for, quite frankly, your target audience. Not a simple task going forward.
No, it is not. That's for sure.
We spoke about, of course, setting the ESG strategy. So essentially defining, what do you want to get out of this program? Is it, purely ticking the box? Is it, what does it mean for people, process, technology across your organization? But maybe let's talk a little bit about process. I'd say, sort of, if you work your way backwards from the outcome, then it's your regulatory reporting, depending on, of course, which industry and which region you're working in. And that's usually an annual document that you need to create. So working backwards from that, what do you believe the core process elements for ESG risk management need to be, and how do they differ from your current risk process?
Wow, there's a lot there. Can you repeat that last part of the question?
So what are the main steps in your ESG risk process, and how does it differ from your ERM process?
I mean, I think there's a lot,
or does it,
that can be leveraged, because I mean, you have standards out there like ISO 31000 that provide very good understanding and approaches to risk management. So I mean, it starts with understanding your objectives, and when you look at the GRC model, the GRC capability model at OCEG, GRC is defined as a capability to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. While addressing uncertainty, that's risk management. And in fact, ISO 31000 defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And act with integrity, that's the compliance. And so, I mean, and you look at things like ISO 31000 and the GRC capability model frameworks, it starts understanding your objectives. In this case, what are the ESG objectives? What are we trying to do? And that gets down to our values. Well, what are the values and the objectives related to those values around the environment, around social, like child labor, forced labor, working hours, working conditions, health and safety, data protection and privacy, and what are the objectives and under governance and tax transparency and all these other areas, and clearly define those objectives. And then what are the risks to achieving those objectives? So once we understand the objectives under the E, the S, and the G, and there's many that can be mapped there, what are the risks to achieving those objectives? What is our risk exposure around each of those objectives? If our objective is to be, have inclusivity and diversity, let's start labeling the risks that can hinder us there, from management and other employees that have different values there. And then how do we address those risks? From once we identify those risks, we then assess those risks. And once we assess those risks, you have 4 options. You can accept the risk as it is. And as you mentioned, there's some ESG related risks you just have to accept. You can do nothing about them. You might avoid the risk by making a decision where there's no longer a risk. And from there, and we see a lot of organizations doing things like that, where they avoid risks by firing people and things that have a history of some bad things. And so that's one, it maybe doesn't completely avoid the risk because there's still potential liability in things of the organization, but that can get in there. So we have accept the risk, avoid the risk, but the one we often focus on is mitigate the risk by putting controls in, particularly when it comes to like security and privacy and things like that. Putting controls in place to mitigate risk. And the other one that a lot of organizations don't think as clearly about, but it's in standard risk assessment methodologies, is risk transfer, like through hedging or insurance and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, insurance is, at least for the E element of ESG, probably one of the most obvious transference there is, or methods of transference. I think my takeaway from your answer there is the ISO 31000, right? So defined risk processes work for ESG. I would strongly agree, but really great to hear your analysis on that. Maybe lastly, to talk a little bit about technology. Now, I'd say the success factors for and this is just my hypothesis here for ESG technology, is I hear you, not another technology added in. So, leverage something existing, ideally in your arsenal, so to speak. The second element that I would argue is usability. Get a technology that is not going to prevent people from interacting with it, that you can actually gain information very easily from people that they're not avoiding using. And last but not least, don't over-engineer it and keep it simple. Those would be sort of my top tips on the ESG technology. What would yours be?
Start with the end in mind is the critical one when it comes to technology, because you want to make sure that you can deliver on the end game that you're trying to achieve. You might have technology out there that you've implemented specifically for IT security, is built for IT security or privacy, and you might try to leverage that and find out that it doesn't really extend. You need agile technology in this area that can deliver on what your end game is. That has the right information architecture, that can see all these different components and mapping of them, but also can, from there, have a lower total cost of ownership for implementation and maintenance that is highly configurable without a lot of custom coding and things. I mean, there's a lot of big consulting firms and others out there that want to make this an absolutely huge project to implement the technology for ESG or GRC. And it doesn't have to be the case, because there's highly agile technology out there that's very versatile, that has a lower total cost of ownership, and it can be configured to your business needs. And that's absolutely critical, is to have that right technology that can not only start your journey, but get you to the end of the journey as well, and has the right information architecture to see all these relationships and risks and things across these different areas, and can model it appropriately. And the other important piece, and I'm just going on and on here, for agile technology, but something that I really find that stands out with Mitratech Align is the user interface and experience. ESG or GRC, and we're putting both these together here. It's not just about the second and third line functions. It's not just about the back office of risk, compliance, audit, security. It's as much or even more about the front office, those front line employees, operational management, executives. And if we're really going to deliver on ESG or GRC or both in context of each other, we need technology that is intuitive and visually appealing and engaging, that the front office and management can leverage and use it without having to have the expertise of a back office risk professional.
I agree. And with that, we want to hear more from you. So the question, and we spoke about this when we spoke about ESG strategy, right? What do you want to get out of it? And so one of the key questions we have here is, how much do you think good ESG management might benefit you financially? No impact, detrimental impact, significant advantage, significant detriment, or I'm not sure. This question kind of brings me back to a white paper I did with one of the partners back in the day at Deloitte when I think it was a new privacy legislation came out in Germany, and basically what we were trying to put in the white paper is, oh, it's going to be a business advantage if you do good privacy. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure about that, if good privacy management is really going to earn you money or just has the ability to lose you a lot of money if you do it poorly. Do you think that's any different in ESG?
Well, I've seen a lot of stats and research that's been done out there that organizations with strong integrity and brands and commitment to values like ESG outperform their competition.
Fair enough.
And so I would think that good ESG management might benefit you financially because you are a more attractive organization. You hire better people, you attract clients and things because of the strong brand and reputation you have for ESG and being fair and transparent out there. So I do think that there is a direct benefit in this area. And a lot of this research and studies is just starting to come out now as well on this. But I would say yes. At the end of the day, your employees matter. They want to, particularly Gen Z and millennials, they're making employment decisions just not on salary and benefit, but they're making employment decisions on the shared values that they have with the organization. Yeah. And if you're hiring better people, that's going to impact your bottom line because they're more attractive and want to be part of your culture because they believe in it. Same thing with your customers and clients. They're making decisions on who they do business with based on ESG metrics and things as well. And so I think that at the end of the day, there is a benefit here.
I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and say operational resilience. So reacting to an adverse effect to your business in an agile way is something that ends up earning money for you, right? Because, you're quicker at your customers, you're delivering services, you have less of a hit to your bottom line. And I would also argue that you cannot be an operationally resilient organization if you do not understand your ESG risks, because a lot of things impacting your organization will in some way, shape, or form be a ESG risk. And so as such, I'd say good management practices will, at least in the medium term, if not definitely in the long term, be a financial benefit for your organization.
Yep.
And this leads us to sort of our final discussion point that I'm actually really excited about, because ESG and culture, and we spoke a little bit, or you alluded to it in sort of the millennial and Gen Z view of the corporate world. I believe these are two incredibly important factors. And I mean, it boils down to, it's all about people, right? There are people that are the employees of the organizations, people that operate technology, and people that make purchasing decisions. So how is ESG going to impact culture, and how is culture going to impact ESG?
To me, culture is ESG. I mean, you're talking about the values of your organization. That's reflected in your culture. I'm an honorary life member and a global ambassador of risk management for the Institute of Risk Management out of London. And about a decade ago, we did this great paper on risk culture, resources for practitioner. And one of the graphics that we leverage and use in that is the ABC model. The attitudes of the individuals, whether they're executives, management, or frontline employees, their attitudes shape the behavior of the organization. The behavior of the organization shapes the culture of the organization, and the culture then influences and has a symbiotic relationship back to the attitudes and the behavior. The culture is the most important asset of an organization. and it can be completely destroyed, particularly from an ESG context, overnight. But particularly on the S, it could take years to decades to repair. And you need to nurture your culture because it's the most important asset for ESG, because that's actually where your values are lived out.
I'm gonna argue, for argument's sake, the other side, that culture is not just an asset to ESG or is ESG, but is also a risk. So one of our mega trends is shifts in people and value. And one of sort of the subsets of that is media and information. And on the other side, another one of the health-focused mega trends are, of course, also pandemics and new illnesses. And I think that we've seen a number of examples where a organization has displayed a very strong culture, and around things that are, for reasons that are hard to comprehend, polarizing, such as facial mask requirements. Right, so you can argue that organizations took a decision to say, okay, we'll have mask mandates for entering our retail locations, and that's part of our culture, and that's part of our rule set in protecting our customers and our employees. And through various polarizations and misinformation, it has become such a political element that essentially this culture that was part of the, you could argue, part of the ESG ethos of this organization also became a risk or a liability for that organization. So I would argue that ESG and culture can work both ways.
It definitely can. You're right.
I also like that we are coming back again to the integrity element. I guess going forward, ESG might force organizations to take a stand. And I mean, the mask mandates are probably, a fairly good example, right? So you could argue that integrity was a strong value that was, I guess, carried from the management of these organizations to say, no, this is what we believe in. This is what we believe is right. Will it, at the end of the day, will it pay off?
Yep. And one of the things here, you've talked about mask mandates and everything else, but one of the risks, and it gets down to the culture and of the organization as well, but also applies to some of the things that Mitratech delivers on the policy side. But I'm seeing a lot of organizations are very concerned about rogue policies around vaccination, around masks, as well as a variety of other things. The organization itself might have done its research and carefully crafted its policies, but then you get some manager, like a bank branch manager, retail store manager, think they're a little smarter than the rest of the organization, and they don't think the policies are strict enough, or they think they're too strict. They think the virus is a hoax and whatever, and they're writing policies that are completely contrary to the organizations. And if these are communicated to employees or customers, and some manager said it's a policy, that puts a legal duty of care and exposure upon the organization. I see a lot of organizations cracking down right now because of rogue policies and trying to create a consistent risk culture and through consistent policies.
And that's where we're back to the standard GRC processes of defining rules and raising awareness in the organization, measuring effectiveness and implementation of controls, and reporting back on them.
Yep.
So maybe sort of some final thoughts on, and maybe we fast forward 5 years into the future. What would you expect to see in an organization that has an active ESG risk culture established? Like, what would you notice when you walk in the door, when you speak to the second line people, for example?
That they have an established risk culture?
Yeah, an active ESG risk culture.
That their values are clearly defined around the ESG, and they're communicated in the code of conduct and training and that your average employee, they may not know all the details about all the different risks and stuff, but they can readily share what those values are. And so I think that that's absolutely critical in defining if somebody's got a strong ESG culture, is that your average employee can tell you what the ESG program is about at a high level, at least an elevator pitch. They might not understand all the details about like child labor and stuff in the supply chain and things like that. Obviously they wouldn't, but they can tell you about the commitments and that they feel that the organization lives up to its values. And I think that's where you get into risk cultural surveys and other things out there that you measure the culture of the organization to find out, what's the tone out there in the organization? Does the workforce in general, feel that the company stands behind its principles?
I love it. Now, Michael, we just have a few questions that I saw come in, and I think we have a few more minutes left. And maybe a good question for you came in. What KPIs should companies focus on with ESG risk? Probably not easy to answer, but maybe sort of the top 2 or 3.
I mean, obviously, this is going to vary by industry, because an ESG program at a bank looks different from a mining company. But also, it's going to vary. I mean, if we're talking high-level KPIs, it's going to be, filtering down to things like the code of conduct and awareness of the code of conduct and things around that at a very high level of the organization. But, there's so many aspects to ESG that I mean, you can't just boil it down to a few KPIs, because each subsegment of ESG is going to have its own KPIs around fraud and bribery and corruption and information security. I mean, at a high level, you can govern the overall reporting and accountability KPIs for ESG in general, but they're going to be so dependent upon a bunch of processes and departments beneath them to deliver.
Yeah, I would even argue, I think the aspiration should be is to have quantification of ESG risk management, right? I mean, we've established that the same processes apply as for enterprise risk management. So why shouldn't you be able to quantify it, right? You need to understand the probability of your ESG risks. You need to understand, financial loss potentials or damages or threats to, individual assets. And, why not quantify and use, value at risk or similar KPIs as in the context of ESG?
That's right.
And maybe just one last question. How would you measure success? When do you call mission accomplished in your ESG program?
Well, first off, I don't think it's ever over. And so a mission accomplished to me is ultimately measured by the culture of the organization and its commitments, that those values are in place. And I mean, it's an integrity metric is what it comes down to me. But at the end of the day, it's never over, because the world is dynamic. I mean, you don't have the exact same brick and mortar business you had 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Employees change, executives change, the board changes, regulations change, the world and risk and geopolitical risks, environmental risks, and health and safety risks, like the pandemic and everything. It's constantly changing, and so your ESG program's never done. sorry. I mean, if you're looking for a program that's done, I mean, this isn't going to deliver. But the world is dynamic and changing, and you've got to constantly adapt.
Agreed. Well, on that motivating note, your dear ESG risk managers out there, your job will never be over. There's always more work to do. Michael, thank you so much for joining us here today. And with that, I think, we'll conclude the webinar and hand back over.
Great. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today for this great discussion of the ESG shift from buzzword to operational GRC. And to our audience, we'd love to have you join us for other upcoming OCEG events. Please watch out for emails from OCEG regarding these future webinars. This concludes our webcast today. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.